More people from Berlin. Ah, Masha, I recognize you.
So hello and welcome. I'm Rosemary Pena, founder and president of the Black German Heritage and Research Association. I am also adjunct professor of German Studies at the University of British Columbia at Vancouver in the Department of Central, Eastern, and Northern European Studies. This morning's conversation is the 18th event in the BGHRA's All Black Lives Matter series and the 12th produced in collaboration with Davidson College. We, my colleague Emily Fraser-Rath and our student Katie Kowalshin and I are delighted to host Josephine Apraku as our honored guest today for what will inevitably be an engaging conversation. But before we begin, I'll ask Emily if she would be so kind as to first acknowledge our sponsors, share a little about our work together, and then formally introduce our first student discussant for a public event who will in turn introduce you to today's special guests. Emily?
Hello, everyone. First, I'd like to thank the Dean Rusk International Studies Program Speakers Fund for helping to sponsor today's event. In particular, I would like to thank the former Dean Rusk Program Director, Jane Zimmerman, and the former Dean Rusk Program Administrator, Sheila Reeves, for their support, as well as Verna Case, the Interim Director of the Dean Rusk Program, for her continued support. We want to thank the Department of German Studies and our fabulous administrator, Meg Sawicki, as well as Jennifer Joyce and Susan Caldwell, who work behind the scenes here at Davidson, doing all of the logistics work and who's helped this semester in organizing and making possible our events has been invaluable. I'm extremely excited to introduce our student today, one of our 8 wonderful students in Black German Art and Resistance this semester, who has agreed to be our moderator and discussant today. She will then in turn introduce our wonderful guest, Josephine Apraku. Katie Kowalshin is a sophomore student at Davidson College with an intended computer science major, who is originally from Connecticut. This semester, as I mentioned, she participated in our co-taught class with Dr. Pena and I, entitled German 231, Black German Art and Resistance. She's enthusiastic about meeting with Josephine to learn more about her work. So I'll pass.
Okay, so we are so excited to be able to invite Josie Apraku to our class, to Davidson College and to the BGHRA today. Today is December 9th, 2021, and we, Dr. Pena, Dr. Fraser-Rath, me, and my classmates and fellow Davidson students are in our final week following a semester spent together in our German 231 class, as Dr. Fraser-Rath just said. As Dr. Fraser-Rath mentioned at the beginning of our conversation with all of our guests this semester, Dr. Pena and Dr. Fraser-Rath co-teach this class together. This class has consisted of 3 parts. It's been first a survey course in the field of Black German Studies. It's also been a community-based learning course as we support the BGHRA through our work, and will feature our final projects, which are actually due tomorrow, on the BGHRA archive. And it's been an opportunity for students and through these recordings, the broader BGHRA and Davidson communities to speak with people whose lives and work intersect with, influence, shape, and inform Black German studies. Once again, we'd like to thank the Dean Rusk International Studies Program Speakers Fund for helping to sponsor today's event. In particular, I would like to thank former Dean Rusk Program Director Jane Zimmerman and former Dean Rusk Program Administrator Sheila Reeves for their support, as well as Verna Case, the Interim Director of the Dean Rusk Program, for her continued support. We want to thank the Department of German Studies Administrator Meg Sawicki, as well as Jennifer Joyce and Susan Caldwell, who work behind the scenes here at Davidson, doing all the logistics work and whose help this semester has been unmatched. It is an honor for me to introduce Josie Apraku this morning. Josie is a scholar of African Studies with an MA in Afrika Wissenschaft from Humboldt University, Berlin. Josie is the co-founder of the Institute for Discrimination-Free Education and has served as a co-facilitator and leader of the education project Here and Now, Colonialism and Colonial Racism in School Teaching at the Anti-Racist Intercultural Information Center in Berlin. From 2015 to 2017, Josie worked as a lecturer at both the Alice Solomon University and at the Center for Transdisciplinary Gender Studies at the Humboldt University in Berlin. Josie also writes columns for the feminist publications Missy Magazine and Edition F. So at this point, if Josie would like to introduce yourself on your own terms, feel free.
You say that so easily, but it's really tough after someone introduces you. So what else can I say about myself? First of all, thank you so much for inviting me. One thing that came up, and I think that could be important to me introducing myself, would be that I'm very much interested in not only transnational, but international connections when it comes to racism, mostly because I very deeply believe that the more I understand and the better that I understand racism, the more I can do to intervene. So when I speak about solidarity, I actually mean not only solidarity amongst Black people, but solidarity amongst everyone who is in any way, shape, or form objected to not only racism, but colonialism that still in different ways lives on today. So I think that is something that is really important to me, which is why I am beyond grateful to be able to speak with you today. Other than that, I am a parent, which is very relevant to what I do also, because something that came up a little bit before when we were speaking just before is the idea of making sure that our work is also intergenerational, which I think is so important as well. So yes, I will just leave it at that, and we'll just start, no?
Yeah, so we can definitely take any. I think Dr. Fraser-Rath put questions or open for questions in the chat, but also through the Q&A thing. I know I'm curious about just your work in general, what your daily work looks like, if you want to elaborate on that while we're waiting for questions.
Mm-hmm. My work looks really different from day to day. So generally what I do is I hold workshops that deal with racism from an intersectional viewpoint, so to speak. I write quite a bit at the moment. I've been writing several columns for quite some time now. What I do at the moment mostly is some kind of, you could say, processes of transformation with different kinds of organizations. So I will be with them for quite some time and actually think about ways in which we can tackle racism within organizations. And I think this is a really interesting thing because most of the time I work with organizations that, for example, do quite a bit of work when it comes to, let's say, sustainability or climate justice. Sometimes I'm working with organizations that are very international, so there will be people working from all different countries. But at the same time, I think something that people most of the time just don't take into account is the fact that when organizations are started, most of the time, people who start them don't think about oppression in general, and they don't think about racism specifically. And that is something that's really interesting to me at the moment, because I'm starting to actually found a new organization myself. So this is something that I've been working with, with quite a few clients on in different organizations. And now I'm in the, I think at least, very beautiful situation to actually try out all of the different steps and measures that I would take with organizations. But another thing that I would like to very briefly touch upon as well is the fact that when you start an organization, there's so many things involved when it comes to, let's say, laws and how to make sure, for example, that someone is safe. And this is something that I've been thinking about quite a lot at the moment. So how can we make sure within our work fields that, for example, that there's a contract that actually grants safety from racism, and how will we then tackle racism when someone experiences it. So this is something that I've been thinking about quite a lot. Other than that, I'm writing not my first book, but it's my first book that I have very freely chosen the topic for, and that has been really interesting. So I'm writing something about oppression and love, and I am very much interested in psychological perspectives with regards to that as well.
What is your, I don't know if you're gonna give away your whole book or anything, but
I can't. I've written all of it, so it's fine. You can
well,
ask.
we do final projects for the class that I'm in with Dr. Pena and Dr. Fraser-Rath, and that's kind of like the general topic that mine is about, because I'm doing mine about attachment styles and
Ooh,
yeah, in general, but also with adoption specifically. So what are you writing your book about?
Oh, that's so interesting. It's really interesting that, to me at least, that you're interested in adoption. I've actually just had a student submitting their BA thesis on transnational, transracial adoptions, which has been really interesting as well. But my book will be about, for a lack of better words, romantic relationships, intimate relationships, and how oppression, different kinds of oppression and discrimination actually show up within relationships. And I'm basically starting from the point that we have a shared understanding of what we mean when we talk about love, which is an understanding. When I say shared, I mean a societal understanding that I think is not helpful at all when we want to deal with oppression within love relationships, which is an understanding of something like love can conquer all. I think about the Beatles song, "Love is all we need," something along those lines. And what I'm really interested in is to actually think about how discrimination, specifically when we talk about it from a systemic perspective, shapes our everyday experiences. So everything that we do is in very different forms and ways shaped by oppression. And that is really interesting to me. So one example would be, who do we actually meet? So should we, for example, go on dating websites? Who do we meet? Who do we find attractive? All of those things are shaped by oppression, but also what we can expect in relationships, the emotions that we show, and how people will in turn show up to our emotions as well, is also shaped by oppression. And that is something that I actually want to look at. So I will be actually taking a few people into account who have done quite a bit of work in this field already. One of them, and it's really interesting because they're two white, probably cis het men, but I am taking into account Erich Fromm's work. He's been doing quite a few things on love. And then also M. Scott Peck, who has been quoted by Bell Hooks, for example. So those are my, you could say, starting points, because they're talking about love very specifically as a practice, something that you do every day, something that you choose actively, something that you engage with, and then also something that doesn't necessarily mean that you always have loving feelings, that you always have, or another couples therapist, her name is Esther Perel, has just written something, I think, on her Instagram account yesterday. Love means having feelings, primitive feelings, loving feelings, and then also obviously loathsome feelings as well. So this will be my starting point. So what I'm trying to do with my book is not only thinking about love as a practice, but an anti-discriminatory practice as well. So what would that mean? What could that look like? And I think, something that I think is, at least to me, is very important and very interesting to me, is also the work that already has been done by scholars when it comes to, for example, a psychologist, a perspective regarding psychology. So I will be talking to, her name is Sarah Adeyinka Skold. She has done an interesting study in, I think, social science on racism and colorism within dating. And then I will be also talking to, he used to be a professor as well in the US. His name is Ronald F. Levant, and he's been doing quite a few things on masculinity. So I will be taking into account quite a few perspectives as well. But this is a very brief gist. So yeah, I hope that's helpful.
Yeah, definitely. That's very interesting. We do have a couple questions. I think in terms of organization, there's this one about what we were just talking about. That's, I'll just read it out. It says, it would be great to hear about oppression and love and the "and" in that phrase. Interested in the connection there about oppression and love, I guess the connection between those two, if it's mutual, reciprocal, transferable, etc. Just in general, that struck me already as kind of timeless literary trope, and curious about that as a literary and cultural trope and psychosocial event. So I guess any elaboration on your perspective on that?
Well, I would say that oppression and love are very deeply connected, specifically because most of the time, it is not something that is, at least in a broader discussion, is not reflected on in a very helpful way. So for example, and I'm looking obviously at it from a German perspective, specifically because I'm always very interested in language. And something, for example, in Germany that comes up is that, and I think that could be true for the US as well, but if I would do a Google search, for example, on something like stalking, and then the next word could probably also be love. So that, just to give an idea, another thing that comes up for me is, oh, you have that too, key to your heart, for example, which I find really interesting. So the idea that our hearts are generally something that are closed and guarded. So it's really interesting to me that love is most of the time depicted as something that is very positive, that is life-giving, that overcomes. Yet at the same time, there are so many things that seem to be legitimized by love as well, which could be stalking, for example, which could be abuse, for example, which could be things like murder even. And those are, and there are quite a few studies on that as well, depending on which types of oppression we actually look at. But there are quite a few studies, for example, when it comes to femicides, that actually connect those two very well. And I think it's really interesting how in broader society, we can also use love as a kind of means to legitimize abuse, oppression, all of those things. And that is something that I find really interesting. So I feel like as society, in a way, we would have to actually choose what do we mean when we talk about love. We need a very clear definition, I feel like. And I personally am in a very, you could say, in a dire need of a definition, because obviously I experience different kinds of oppression which intersect also, and they come up in romantic relationships. And the question that I find interesting is, when we have a definition, what can we actually do with that? And that is my starting point when it comes to Scott Peck, for example, but others as well, which actually takes us very far away from different types of abuse and brings us to not only a practice, but also a responsibility, a choice that we have. So I think love and oppression are very deeply connected, you could say. And also I'm thinking of, I'm sorry, I was just thinking of Cornel West and his quote, justice is what love looks like in public. And I really like that, because I feel like justice is also love in action, is also a practice of love within intimate relationships. And I think that is something that we need to take into account more. And that would mean that we actually know about our social position. And by that, I don't necessarily only mean the aspects in which we actually, experience oppression, but also our privilege as well. I think it's so important to heal all of our, you could say, social positions in order to be able to actually experience intimacy, I would say.
Thank you. This is a topic shift, but Someone asked, are you hopeful about the new government in Germany regarding their approach to tackling racism, especially in education and culture?
The very short answer is never, mostly. And it's not necessarily because I don't think that we have a specifically bad government at the moment. To those who might actually don't know. So we just held elections in September, and now the new government is forming, which is really different from the US, because in the US, it's relatively clear what that would mean. But because in Germany, there are several parties and they go into coalition as well and then form a new government, that actually takes quite a bit. I mean, roughly, it roughly takes 3 months, you could say. To actually know who is going to do what in the starting from 2022. And I think what is really interesting to me is, for example, in Germany, we actually had, how do you call those discussions again? You have discussions like that as well with the two people who are running for the presidency. There's a specific word for that. How do you call them? Presidential,
like debates, maybe?
Thank you. I was looking for the presidential debate. Yeah. So we had them too, but this time around, we actually had 3 guests participating in them. And what was really interesting to me is, for example, there's the Green Party, and the leader of the Green Party was saying something to the extent of, we have to fight racism. We have to be very clearly positioned against racism and things like that. But at the same time, she also says, we as a country, meaning Germany as a country, needs to take responsibility abroad, which sounds honorable, but most of the time means, being in different ways, being part of war and conflict as well. So I think from an anti-racist perspective, I find it very important to actually check what that would mean, because most of the time I feel like there isn't enough reflection on that as well. And then also because Germany's, and I think that could be very similar in the US as well, but in Germany, I feel like part of the problem is that everything should be voted on a basis of democracy. But then when you talk about minorities, obviously it's very hard to do because you need those who aren't part of the minorities as well. So when it comes, for example, to anti-Black racism, just to paint a picture, there are roughly 1 million Black people in Germany, Black Germans, Africans, which would mean that, Black people in Germany are roughly not even 2% of the whole population. So if you want your government to do something about anti-Black racism, you're virtually lost when you come or when you come from an understanding that the majority has to be interested in something to change. And I feel like that's a general issue when it comes to oppression. Not necessarily it's still an issue when it comes to sexism, but sexism isn't a kind of oppression that actually oppresses minorities in the same ways as, let's say, ableism or racism in Germany, for example. So no, I don't think that there will be major changes. Cosmetic ones, most definitely, but not necessarily major changes.
Okay, I'm going to combine the next 2 kind of together. One is about your perspective, which you were kind of just talking about, but if you could go more in depth between racism and its roots in anti-Blackness specifically, what that looks like in Germany. And then also if you could talk about the Afro census and the response, like the public response. Sure.
Oh, so the Afro census is relatively new. I think it was published last week, if I am not mistaken. So I find it really hard to actually say anything about the public response because I'm not part of the Afro census team. So I will probably not be the best source when it comes to how the public has actually embraced or not embraced their findings. But I can tell you, obviously, from my personal perspective, I think it's such an important study that has been done, mostly because I think, and that is very different from the US as well. So the census in Germany doesn't work with regards to race. It doesn't take race into account. And I think that is very specific to Germany's history with regard specifically, by the way, to the NS times. And that is kind of, that does something with regards to democratic ideas. Again, I've been saying that, you know, if you suffer from, or if you deal with oppression from a minority perspective, it does something. And I think specifically with regards to the census, we do actually have categories such as Muslim, but at the same time, they aren't helpful as well, because people are put into those categories who wouldn't necessarily ascribe Muslim to themselves. So it's really kind of tough to kind of to have anything helpful when it comes to racism in Germany. Most of the time, when we talk about racism in Germany, we will talk something along the lines of migration, and I feel like that isn't helpful as well, because obviously not everyone who migrates is affected by racism as well. So, so I'm really glad actually that they've done the study, because I feel like it's very specific. So they've been asking things not only with regards to workspace, but also things that are really specific. Something along the lines could be, have you withdrawn from social activities because you are affected by racism? Are there specific, for example, are there specific areas in your life that you're trying to avoid because you're affected by racism? What are areas that you would think you would have the most racist encounters, for example? So I think the study is very, very important. And I think it's very important that it has been done, because we don't have anything when it comes to anti-Black racism in Germany that could be, specifically, by the way, from the government, we don't have anything that could be helpful to actually get a better picture of anti-Black racism. And I think it's really important to have a clear picture of anti-Black racism, because we talk about racism in general, and in Germany with regards to the work that has been done within universities, and trust me, it's not a lot, but we talk about racismen, so different kinds of racism, you could say. And I think it's really important also, by the way, from an intersectional perspective, to actually get a clear understanding of the different types of racism that operate within German society, mostly because if there's something we want to do, and again, if we want to intervene, we have to get a very clear understanding of how the different types of racism work, because they don't necessarily all work in the same way. So for example, there's, it's not a huge discussion, but there is a discussion on, how do you say that? You could say anti-Slavic racism. I don't have a better word for that in English to translate, but there has been quite some debate on that topic. And there are some people who say, well, yes, it's racism, obviously. And then there are some people who say, well, it makes sense to have a specific word because, you know, Slavic people, at least some of them, you know, view themselves as white and Christian, for example. So I think it's really important to understand how those different types of racism work, because anti-Black racism, not only, but it most of the time, you know, work because Black people are visible in a very specific way, and also are a minority as well. So I think that in and of itself does something with the way Black people experience racism in Germany.
Thank you. Someone said that you briefly mentioned Bell Hook's work, which articulates possibilities for love as a liberatory practice. And they're curious if your upcoming book will be in conversation with those ideas of love as liberation as well.
Most definitely. But that is why I am so keen on having a clear definition as well. I think, yes, it can be, but I think in order to make sure that love is a practice of liberation, we need to be very clear on what we mean when we talk about love, and we need to be very clear on what we mean, you know, when we talk about oppression, and how those two actually engage with each other. and how to kind of make sure that we intervene at those points that they actually interact. So yes, all of the things that I do from a place of hope. So it will be the same for the book as well.
What would you identify? This is a good one. What do you think are the top priorities for anti-racist work in education? I think also more broadly in the coming years.
Oh, that's, I feel like that's a really tough question. So for quite some time, I have been, for example, analyzing school textbooks when it comes to history, for example, how has colonialism been dealt with within German schools and within German history books, to be more specific, over time. That is something, for example, that I did some research on. But if I'm being honest, I feel like, and I know that that is not, that doesn't necessarily have to be anti-racist. And I feel like the US is a very good, gives me a very good idea of that. But I feel like because in Germany, every child has to go to school. And I feel like this is something that we need to think about and talk about as well. I feel like we need more alternatives to the public schooling system. And by that, I mean to be able to say, I don't have to send my kid to school. I feel like that is something that could be relevant as well. I realize that that would mean organizing a whole lot, honestly, to make sure that children of color are able to, have alternative schooling, because, and I think that's the same in the US as well. History, when it comes to racism, sorry, Siri is trying to say it. It's really weird. Siri has been every once in a while being like, oh, what do you want? It's really strange. But I feel like history is not reflected from an anti-racist perspective with regards to Germany. And one aspect that I, for example, find really important is the connection between the NS times and German colonialism. So, for example, what most people don't know is that there have been, people like Eugen Fischer, for example, who has done his first, I don't even like to call it research, but who's done his first racist work with regards to racist theories during German colonial times in the first German concentration camp, which was in Namibia, and he kept on doing his work during the NS era as well. So I think that is something, for example, that needs to change. But if I'm being honest, I feel like public schooling systems will probably not be the drive for change. And if I'm being honest, it might sound dire, but it's not. I don't necessarily feel that way. I feel like most of anti-racist work is not necessarily work that has been institutionalized. And I do actually hope that that will change in the future. But at the same time, I feel like, but maybe that's part of its power at the same time, that it's operating beyond institutions.
Thank you. The next one is, when you're speaking about love and the intersection of adoption, whether domestic or international, have you had any experiences with any facilitators of creating families when the narrative of the agencies and adopters seem to be based on antiquated assumptions around race?
Never. It's really interesting to me because I have and I'm being very honest here, but I have no idea specifically how the German adoption system works. So I could only talk about perspectives beyond reality, if I'm being honest. So I will probably not be a helpful person.
This one says, today, American Psychological Association hosts an event that's called Essential Science Conversations, APA Apology to Communities of Color, Implications for the Future of Psychological Science. What do you see as the next steps that need to come after that apology worldwide, or do you see significant movements of that kind in Germany in relation to, I guess, psychology, academia in general?
Mm-hmm. Oh, that's a good question. So I'm not very deeply rooted within discussions around psychology in Germany, but I do know a few psychologists of color, Black psychologists in Germany. And what I do know is that whenever, for example, they are trying to deepen their understanding, let's say within a workshop, discrimination in general and oppression are not taken into account. So for example, I was actually thinking about doing some education around becoming a couples therapist myself. And I know that it's nearly, or I would actually say it's probably impossible to find anything that takes oppression into account. There are actually schools that do this kind of work, and they are very clear that they feel like oppression should not be part of their curriculum, and they think it's not important to what they're doing. So I would guess with regards to Germany, that there's not so much being done. Personally, I find that there are international perspectives that are much more interesting. By the way, one of the, or a few actually of the people that I will be talking to are actually, I actually found them through the APA. So I think that there is a little bit of work being done here as well. But to be honest, I don't think it's a whole lot in the US as well. I think that that is something, and that's, by the way, something that I find really interesting with regards to Bell Hooks. She quotes a few people who have done work around psychology and are touching upon oppression, but most of the time they do so very lightly. For example, there's someone I wanted to talk to as well. His name is Terry Real. And Terry Real is a couples therapist. And I find his work really interesting because he very clearly states that with regard, or that the patriarchy also operates within relationships. So what he's doing, and I find that interesting specifically because I am an anti-racist educator as well, is he basically says, well, I use my privilege within my couples therapies and say something like, look, I get it. I'm a man as well. I know, I know where you're coming from, but I can tell you, you can basically choose patriarchy or your relationship, and you have to be very sure that you're actually making a choice, a knowledgeable choice at the, in the first place. And I find that really interesting because I feel like that can be a form of allyship, and I feel like it makes so much sense with regards to couples therapy specifically to be very clear about your own social position and to take it into account with regards to your work. But I feel like even Terry Real, who is doing that, I feel like he is doing that very much informed by research with regards to psychology. And it's really interesting because I feel like there's so much overlap with regards to the research within fields that deal with oppression, social science, for example. There's so much overlap, but then at the same time, because I feel like psychology, not necessarily always, but very often looks at things that are comparable, that some aspects I feel like get lost. So when I talk about oppression, I do that very much from a discursive perspective. So I would not necessarily say things, let's say 70 years ago were, very, very different from now, but the way that they operate or are slightly different. So for example, when I talk about German school textbooks with regards to history, I could see that in the 70s, in German history books, they would still use the N-word, and you don't necessarily see that now. But you see the same ideas coming up. And that is something that I feel like is very important. And I feel like when it comes to psychology, and I've been looking a little bit at aspects that deal with masculinity, for example, I feel like, or everything I've read at least and heard most of the time when it comes to, for example, masculinity, then the idea is very much that there is a kind of, you could say, old masculinity that is, that could be, the generation of my mom, that could affect men of their generation. and that there is a change. And I would say, yes, there probably is a change, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it really is a change for the better. I think that that is something that we actually really have to look at very closely. So yeah, so I feel like there needs to be much more work. And I honestly, most of the work that I am reading with regards to oppression is from English-speaking countries. It's not from Germany. There are a few people who are published here as well, but there are not too many, if I'm being honest. And by the way, this is something that is relatively new. So for example, when it comes to Germany, I've just read something, I don't know the specific dates, but for example, that being gay has not been part of how do you call it? Has not been thought of as a mental illness or a deviancy is relatively new in Germany as well. I mean, relatively new. I was probably already alive when they have changed that. And I'm 35 to just make that clear. So it's relatively new here too.
Thank you. I'm wondering if you could speak more just in general about your ideas, opinions on allyship and solidarity with all of the things that you're talking about. And then also in relation to that, because you were just talking about the difference between US and Germany in scholars and like what you're researching, if you also want to talk about racism between the two countries, anything you've seen, experienced, or want to talk about?
Yeah, so let me speak on the, and I will probably have to get back to you for the first part of the question, but let me talk a little bit about differences when it comes to how racism or a racist discourse works in Germany or operates in Germany. Something that I find really specific to the way racism functions in Germany is the idea that only white people can be German. And I think that is very specific to the way racism works. So for example, and I could imagine that this question also exists in the US, but I would say to a different extent probably. So for example, Black people, people of color will very often be asked, where are you from? And if I, for example, say I'm from Berlin, people will say, no, but where are you from really, for example? And that is very inherent in the idea that whiteness and Germanness are tied together, but also not only whiteness and Germanness, but also being white, being German, and speaking German are kind of intertwined in racist discourse within Germany. And I think that is something that is very specific. Then another aspect, and I think this actually relates to that aspect as well, is the fact that German colonialism was something that seemed to be very far away from Germany. So its impacts are not necessarily that you would have many Black Germans, for example, or people of color from all over the world, really, from the German colonies in Germany. And I think that is something that is very different, specifically because the US is a settler colony, and that is not the same when it comes to Germany. So I feel like this is something that is a major difference between the two as well. But at the same time, and I think that is something, especially with regards to solidarity, I think it's important. And this is a very simple point, but racism holds up white supremacy, and that is something that works globally. And I think I feel like this is the main, obviously, similarity, but I think it's such an important one, specifically when it comes to solidarity. So for me, I can only speak to myself and speak about what allyship for me means personally. Something that I feel is very important to me is that I, as good as I can, obviously, but to make sure that I understand at least parts and sections and moments of how racism works in different countries. Let's say Australia, for example. What do Indigenous Australians deal with at this very moment? What does that look like? But also, when I think about the US, I obviously ask myself, how does racism affect Black people in the US, but not only Black people, I think about Indigenous Americans as well. So to me, it's really important to understand as far as I can, and I'm, only one human being with a very small brain and so many things that I could learn, but that is something that is really, really important to me, because I feel like I need all of this knowledge, not only to be able to be in solidarity, and that could be a small thing, sometimes, for example, when I hold a workshop, I talk about self-designations, and a word that is most of the time, for example, when I've just talked about Australia, but most of the time, even people who actually are really knowledgeable when it comes to racism will use racist terms when they talk about Indigenous or Aboriginal Australians. And it's a small thing, but I think it's really important to get a better understanding of how racism works as a whole, to understand its specifics. And I feel like it does something, at least for me, it does something when I think about solidarity, because I realize that even within racist discourse, I'm still very privileged. And to me personally, it's really important to speak on that, because I realize that even with regards to anti-Black racism, Germany, I'm still very privileged. So I am an academic, for example. I speak German fluently. I have a German passport. I'm not negatively affected by colorism when it comes to its intersection with anti-Black racism, for example. I have pretty privilege that is relevant to it as well. So there are so many things. I'm able-bodied, for example. So there are so many aspects of my identity that are privileged, and it does something in how people perceive me and how people will listen to what I have to say, about the way how people will take me seriously. So all of those things. And so I feel like it's really important to me to make sure that when I talk about allyship, specifically from a Black perspective, I don't talk about allyship only between, Black people, people of color, BIPOC, and white people, because I feel like most of the time, and I'm very glad that that is changing, but I feel like most of the time, when we talk about racism, that is something that, that we are always trying to make white people understand how racism functions so that they can be allies. And I feel like that is very valid. And I think that is important as well. But I really like the term, and we don't have an equivalent in German, but global majority. I really like that term, because I feel like there's so much power in that. And I feel like, I live in Germany. It's a country that is, very relevant, for example, when we talk about climate change. So I've just seen a video today, which I really liked. And the person was basically breaking down, it's not we who are responsible for climate change, but there are actually, a few countries, a few people who are doing the majority of the work when it comes to climate change. And I feel like, there are so many aspects, specifically also only from an anti-racist perspective, that I have to be an ally, and that I have to be an ally to people who experience racism very differently from me. So when I talk about, for example, the connections between anti-Semitism and anti-Black racism in Germany, I talk about the connections between VNS and also colonialism. It's really important to me. It's really important to me mostly because I feel like I understand racism better, and the better I understand it, the more I can do against it. And also, and the same, by the way, is very specifically when I look at my family tree when it comes to colorism, I want to make sure that I can do, or that I do as much as I can to not be divided by those that I want to stand in solidarity with. So, yeah. I think that's a basis. And I want to talk about the aspect of colorism specifically when it comes to my family, because I feel like most of the time we talk about colorism in a way that we would talk about racism. And I feel like I don't necessarily feel like it works the same way. So for example, I have a child, and my child has much lighter skin than I have. And my father, for example, has much darker skin than I have. And specifically, even though I hold privilege when it comes to colorism divides me from my family members. So this is something that I find really important. And this is something that I really think about deeply. So what does that mean? Or when I think about, for example, one of my younger sisters, I know that the way she experiences this world, and I've been talking about relationships a little bit, but the way she experiences violence, also racist violence and colorist violence within relationships, is very different than from what I experience. And this is something, that I need to understand better, not only to be, her sister and to be a loving person to her and to be here for her, but also to understand what I can do against systemic violence, really. I'm trying not to ramble. Sorry.
No, those are good. We could do another question. This is, how do you see your work as an activist intellectual has evolved over time?
I feel like maybe the best example is I started doing guided tours on colonialism within Berlin, within the so-called African Quarter, which is a colonial quarter. And I started doing that roughly 15 years ago. So I just started studying African studies at the Humboldt University. And also the African Quarter is not far from where I live. And so I thought, honestly, it's a good way to earn money as a student, which it turns out it really isn't. But it's still, I think it was still very, very enriching because when I started studying, I always felt like there's theory and then there's practice, and those two don't necessarily kind of touch upon each other, which I feel like isn't true at all. But I feel like you have to make sure you kind of move between, and it's not really between because they belong together, but kind of move between those two to make sure you actually understand not only theories, but also the practice. And I feel like this is something that has changed very much. So I never really feel like I have to make a distinction between theory and practice because those two always belong together. I think that's one thing. And then also the more I read, the more I learn really, the more I can do. And I feel like the guided tour is a good example because at the beginning, I actually had written, down a few points. So to make sure that, I would not forget anything. And it was also, that's really, actually, I find it really endearing now, but to make sure that I actually, have the dates right and stuff like that, because I was really scared in the beginning that there would be people on the tour who know more about German colonialism. But it really turns out people in Germany didn't even think that Germany was in any way involved in colonialism. So, I really was on the safe side. I just didn't know. But when I started, I would roughly take an hour, and now I could walk probably 5 hours and talk about things. It's mostly because I've, have started reading more and having more connections and connecting aspects that, in the beginning, I just didn't know. So I feel like it's an expansion, and I'm really, honestly, this is something, by the way, that I really, really like, because I feel like, and this is something that is, I feel like, very normalized when you talk about oppression in general, is that you have to keep on learning. And that is something that I personally really appreciate, because I'm a very nerdy person. I want to know all of the little things if I can, because the little things are important. They really, those are the things that also matter. And I feel like this is something that is really encouraged when you talk about oppression, which I really like.
Thank you. I'm not sure. Do we have time for another question or two?
I'll just ask if there's anything that you'd like to mention that we did not ask about. It's something that you'd like to mention that you're working on, or an idea that you'd had hoped that we would have asked.
No, not really, but something that came up when we talked a little bit before we actually started our session is something that is really dear to my heart, and it's connection. And it's connection because I think, and I've used the term global majority. I think it's such an important term to kind of start off, mostly because I think we really have to make sure that our fights work globally because our problems are global. So I'm really thankful actually for you reaching out and talking, because I think it's so important. And I think something that is very specific to Black people in Europe, I think in general, not necessarily, I would say, or not as much in the UK and not as much maybe in France, but other than that, I feel like is that most of the time in discussions we're invisible. And I think it's so important that we aren't, because also, for example, I was talking about colorism a little bit. I think also when it comes, for example, to colorism, I think it's so important that we can make sure that we understand how colorism, operates in ways, for example, that is very similar to the US, but in ways in which it's also very different from the US. So, for example, I would say, or I would argue that colorism in Germany is also very much, most of the time at least, intersecting with migration, for example. And I think that that is something that is very specific, not only to the German racist discourse, the understanding that, if you're German, you have to be white, or I would say with regard to colorism, an aspect that is relevant as well is having a white parent, for example, and in a way being or not being seen as foreign, for example. So I think it's really important that we have, those kinds of discussions to be as precise and specific, not only in what we know about racism, but also in the ways in which we're making sure that we work against racism. So I just wanted to say I'm thankful for that.
Before we close, Josie, I have a question. We spoke briefly about the different generational challenges earlier. And I know that your work studies a lot about history, and perhaps you could share just a little bit about how your historical research impacts your activism, and also what are some of the new challenges that perhaps the younger generation faces, and how might the older generation assist the younger folks in dealing with those challenges?
So I think for me, a historic perspective is really important. And I've said that so my thinking very much stems from a discourse analysis perspective. And it does a lot with how I understand our world in general, which is, and I think it touches upon what I said when it comes to when I was, for example, talking about masculinities and how masculinities are researched on when it comes to psychology, and the idea of we start at a point that doesn't work as well, and then we do things and things will change for the better. And from a discourse perspective, I really don't have that belief. I don't think that things simply change for a better. And I also, which is why, by the way, I do find education important, but not necessarily as important. So I think there's this very strong belief that if everyone would just be, educated on the matters of racism, and we've talked about that briefly, by the way, in the beginning as well, that all people would be anti-racist. It simply isn't true. So I don't necessarily believe that things just change for the better. I do think that they change, and I think they can change, at least in little parts. But I think it's really important to stay focused and to make sure that you always take a look at the details, because even if things change, and I think that ties into the generational aspect as well. Something, for example, that I can see is in Germany, you can see that marketing is changing around different products. So you'll have quite a few Black people, for example, doing, adverts for the Deutsche Bahn, for example, or for, some kind of telecommunication organization or what have you. And I think, yes, representation is important, but I think And I think that is, I mean, I don't necessarily see me as the young generation. When I talk about the young generation, I think about my sister who just did her GCSE, so she's 19. But when I think of her, I think it will be different even from what I know, because I used to be the only Black child in my school. That's not necessarily true for her. Also connecting with people who have experienced racism in like the different stages of their lives is not as hard as what it looked like for me. So that is something that has changed. But at the same time, I think she has to make sure in a different way, for example, than I had to make sure, and that I still have to make sure, that she is very much on her toes, because I think things are starting to look different. And I think that's the point where you actually kind of have to open the door and look behind the door, what's actually happening. And I know that organizations, at least now, and I'm working with organizations that are very keen on changing their ways. And I know it's hard for them in very different ways, but I know that behind closed doors, things are, still running very smoothly in the way that things have been running for quite some time. So I think her job will be very different from what my job has been.
And I'm very, very sorry, but that's our time for today. Thank you so much, Josephine, for sharing your time with us this morning. And I personally look forward to our next conversation. So as always, we're grateful for Davidson College for continuing to make these important events possible. A special thank you to our audience for continuing to engage with us by not only attending our events and speaking with our guests, but also for helping us to spread the word when we advertise and for watching the recordings when you miss the event. Please stop by bghra.org, bearing in mind that we've still got lots of housekeeping to do since our recent redesign. We hope you'd like our new look and will return often as we work to restore and add new content. Also, follow us on Eventbrite, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter to learn more about upcoming events in the All Black Lives Matter series. We will soon be announcing other lectures and film screenings for December and January that you won't want to miss. Our YouTube channel hosts all of the recordings from earlier episodes and from our 4 international conferences, and this one will be added very soon. Today's conversation will, as I said, be among them. So also please mark your calendars for February 17th to the 20th, 2022, when we will host the 5th BGHRA conference celebrating our 10th anniversary virtually and hosted by Africana Studies at Rutgers University, Camden. We hope that you've enjoyed today's conversation as much as we have. And until next time, thank you again for your time and attention.